Though the Lord be high, he cares for the lowly. He perceives the haughty from afar. O Lord, make us the humble servants of your peace. Take our minds and think through them. Take our mouths and speak through them. Take our hands and work through them, and take our hearts and set them on fire for Christ's sake. Amen. Well, you'll notice in your bulletins today that I actually have a title listed by the sermon, The Choice of Discipleship. I don't often mention the titles I give my sermons. Often they're not even worth a passing glance. But this week, I think our sermon title deserves a little more attention. It came to me because we are currently studying Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his seminal work, The Cost of Discipleship, each Saturday morning. And Bonhoeffer's choice of discipleship led to his bearing its brutal cost at the hands of fascists who had taken control of his beloved nation. And today we also face an historic moment where the choice of discipleship, of truly following Jesus, may be as critical or consequential as it has ever been in our nation's history. Religious participation is a relatively easy choice for most people. You either like it or you don't. A particular worship style either speaks to you or it doesn't. One style of music puts you in a glorious state of mind, and another may be like nails on a chalkboard. The social narratives that underpin its message either inspire you or turn you off. But choosing to be a disciple with all the discipline, obedience, and courage that requires, that's a commitment and a risk on a whole other level. At the beginning of today's story, we know a few things. It's early in Jesus' ministry. He had just proclaimed, quoting the prophet Isaiah, good news for the poor, rescue for the captives, healing for the sick and impure, freedom for the oppressed. And he had been preaching in synagogues all around Galilee, but he had strayed from the Jewish theological orthodoxy of his day by illustrating God's generosity and love were not exclusively reserved for the Jews. And his inclusive preaching got him chased to the edge of a cliff by good religious people who wanted to throw him off. That sets a stage. And given that the northern and western shores of the Galilee are not a large geographic area, it's easy to understand why a word about Jesus and his recent teaching and trouble spread like wildfire throughout the region. And today we find Jesus preaching again, but not in a synagogue, at the lakeshore. And instead of good, pious Jews trying to kill him, he was surrounded by religiously and ethnically diverse Galilean common folk who were enthusiastically trying to get close to him. Word travels fast, and a good scandal is great publicity. In fact, he was so mobbed by the curious and enthusiastic crowd that he needed to borrow a boat and push off from shore so that he could be seen and heard. And what's more, it was now daytime. Simon and the other fishermen were cleaning their nets after an unsuccessful night's work, a disaster given the oppressive economics of their profession. And if you want to understand those dynamics better, I invite you to read Diana Butler Bass's essay that I posted this morning on Facebook. And the fact that these fishermen were cleaning their nets indicated that they were using a very specific type of net. They were made of linen. And that material made such nets very visible and only useful for nighttime fishing, when the fish couldn't see them. But Jesus, after proclaiming the good news to the crowd, said to Simon, "Simon, put out in the deep water and let down your nets," which was an absurd proposition from any professional fisherman's perspective. They were in the wrong place, the deep water, hearing the wrong message, fish here and now, using the wrong tools, a very visible net. And yet somehow God made abundance happen against all odds. And not only that, their catch was enormous. It not only almost broke their boats, their nets and their boats, it threatened to break their understanding of the world and themselves. It was a wonderful parallel to the wrong location, the wrong message, and the wrong crowd gathered at the lakeshore moments before. And it was coming from the mouth of the wrong guy who nearly got himself killed days before for preaching the wrong things. But then came perhaps the most powerful irony of all. Simon Peter himself saw himself as the wrong person to be in the presence of such divine power. "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." How could such a one as he become Christ's disciple, much less a rock of the church? It's not unlike the sentiment that Isaiah expressed when he encountered the divine vision. "Woe is me, I am lost, for I'm a man of unclean lips. And yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." But Jesus knew something more. Jesus knew that God uses what's broken, weak, and wrong in the eyes of the world. And fortunately, like Isaiah before him, Simon Peter stepped out to follow this radical, scary, and unwelcome divine calling. Jesus says to his nascent disciples, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." Now, the Greek verb for catch used here has multiple meanings. It can be used as a synonym for the earlier verb Luke uses for catching fish. But it also refers to the process of rescuing someone. Ironically, the first disciples that Jesus caught, they weren't the intellectuals of the synagogue, the pious, the powerful, and the influential. I mean, after all, they're the ones we might expect to possess the tools for leading and saving the people. No, Jesus caught these simple fishermen, and one in particular who deeply knew his own flaws. And perhaps that is the most resonant truth presented in today's scriptures. Humility trumps arrogance every time. Now, most people spend their lives trying to cultivate security through success, or at least the appearance thereof. And how do we appear successful? Well, we make a good impression. We market our best qualities. Don't let them see us sweat. We build ourselves up and how we present ourselves to the world. But the motivation behind this strategy is fear. We need to be liked or agreed with or seen as strong or popular or smart or wealthy. And the problem is that none of us are all or any of those things much of the time. If we're honest with ourselves, we know that we're lacking in so many ways. So for some people, that means they never own their own potential for being God's vessels. They're too afraid. They hide their lamp under a bushel. While others cultivate the lie that they are better and more worthy than others. And to prove it, they spend their lives pointing out the visible flaws of others, ridiculing their looks or their intellects or their handicaps. They are too afraid of being found out, of having their lies exposed, of being the frauds that they are. And the louder the pomposity and the more outrageous their show, the greater the probability it is that they belong to this second group. But Luke shows us straight off that there is something different about Simon Peter's orientation. And perhaps that's why Jesus attracts him as a disciple. I mean, think about it. Simon walked away from the wealth of a huge catch. Who does that? Wouldn't most people first say, hey, well, let's at least take the catch to market, right? And then we'll catch up later. But some people wouldn't take such success. I mean, some people would take this success as a sign that they deserve it. But Simon Peter doesn't. The first trait we learn about Simon Peter's personality is that he has humility in abundance at his disposal, falling to his knees and saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." And he would need all that humility because it would take him and the other disciples a long time to be groomed as effective witnesses of the good news. After all, they failed miserably over and over. Right? Jockeyed for position as the Messiah's right-hand man. They wanted to call down judgment on those who rejected Jesus and his teaching. They ran and hid when things got tough. Simon Peter would deny knowing Jesus 3 times after his arrest. And finally, they locked themselves in an upper room, cowering with guilt and shame as Jesus is executed. Good show, folks. Any one of these failures could have destroyed the egos of those who dare not confront their own flaws. But for a practiced and repentant personality, all these failures serve to strengthen their confidence in the man whose message was, "You are forgiven." It's that same grace and forgiveness that enabled Paul to become the first great evangelist throughout the Mediterranean world, despite his faults. "For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am." Peter and Paul were perfectly imperfect disciples, and they didn't use it as an excuse to do nothing. Jesus groomed the disciples by living out God's gracious and forgiving presence repeatedly. The disciples watched him heal, cleanse, proclaim forgiveness to so many on the margins of their society, even to their oppressors. They saw his non-retributive nature when he was abused and imprisoned and executed. And finally, they experienced his risen presence despite their faithlessness and their cowardliness. And they heard his proclamation of peace and forgiveness. We must be groomed as well. Because the choice to follow a man like Jesus, to be his disciple, takes chutzpah. because God enters through our brokenness and humility, through our pain, our failures, and sins. How else can we be open to him? I mean, it's incredibly difficult. Living in a world where humility is seen as weakness, where all around us we see people who assert authority by bullying and puffing themselves up, even though they are ultimately the weak ones. And they can't handle that truth. They can't face their own complicity and choose to be a disciple. So they cling to their lies like life jackets, lest they drown in the floods of truth. Discipleship to Jesus is one of the bravest and toughest choices we are called to make, especially when the world gives us an easy out. Oh, come on. You only have to look away. You don't have to do anything. You just say you're a disciple. Proclaim you're saved by Jesus. Utter the sinner's prayer. It's that simple. But it never is, because following Jesus has a cost, and that we must bear. We can't impose it on anyone else, because in that case, we're just like the weak bullies. Fortunately, no matter how extensive our shortcomings, and we all have them, so long as we come back and follow and listen to Jesus, to his message at work in our community and lives, so long as we come here with a deep sense of gratitude for the divine gifts to which no one is more entitled than any other, so long as we stretch our muscles of humility and forgiveness and grace, there's nothing that God cannot achieve in and through us. We too are perfectly imperfect disciples. And we're strongest when we embrace and accept our human weaknesses. We're most free when we enslave ourselves to Christ's divine truth. How ironic is that? But how joyful. But like a burning coal to the lips, we can't expect it to be painless. Thanks be to God.